own some of the perkiness that comes with ADHD, some of the creativity and the uniqueness that is the ADHD brain of often very wonderfully creative, intelligent, and successful people. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. I'm Dr. Robbins, and I'm a clinical psychologist specializing in ADHD across the lifespan, diagnosing and treating it. And I run the Annapolis ADHD Center in Maryland, where I treat a number of clients and have a lot of them with ADHD and perfectionism as well. So I can share some of my wisdom from working with them, as well as some of my knowledge about it with you. And I look forward to doing that. I am also a chapter coordinator for CHAD as well. So like you, I am in the community helping folks learn more about ADHD. So I'm going to start by defining perfectionism and its various subtypes. And then we're going to explore the relationship between perfectionism and ADHD and explain how anxiety fits into this duo. And then we're going to discover some effective strategies to overcome perfectionism. And we're going to learn about how important it is to change your mindset and to have self-compassion and self-love. And then there are some resources at the end for you to have that I have referred to in the talk, as well as some additional materials that you might find useful to explore on your own. So what is perfectionism? This is a definition that I found in the American Psychological Association's Dictionary of Psychology. Perfectionism is defined as the tendency to demand of others or of oneself an extremely high or even flawless level of performance in excess of what is required by the situation. It is associated with depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and other mental health problems. It is a cognitive distortion that can be maladaptive, and it's part of a personality trait, not actually an anxiety disorder per se. So features of perfectionists, they tend to be quick to find fault and are overly critical of mistakes, both of their own and of others often. They tend to procrastinate on a project out of their fear of failure. So if it's not, they're afraid it's not going to be good enough, so they procrastinate starting it and can't quite get themselves to do it because it's very overwhelming then, because it needs to be perfect. So they shrug off compliments often and forget to celebrate their own successes, kind of minimizing the good things they do. And instead, they look to specific people in their life for approval and validation. And so if you're in school, it might be a professor or a teacher, or it could be a parent if you're younger, or it could be a partner or a boss. So perfectionism can also be healthy. And some of my high-functioning, very high-achieving clients tend to compensate fairly well with some perfectionistic tendencies. So it's a trait, and it exists somewhat on a continuum, much like ADHD. So you can have a little, a lot, or a moderate amount, and it can be beneficial when it's not too extreme. It can be healthy and adaptive when it comes from an achievement-oriented approach. It can help with self-motivation and drive one to overcome adversity and achieve success. Healthy perfectionists tend to set lofty goals, to have high standards, and to work relentlessly hard for their success. So they tend to be ones who can persevere and follow through, which does help with drive and self-discipline. And they tend to desire growth and enjoy being challenged and to problem solve well. So in this way, their perfectionistic tendencies can be a strength, not a weakness. And sometimes it works well as long as it's not at too high a cost. So some of my clients do well academically, let's say, if they're in grad school. I have several I just saw this week in medical school and nursing school and different endeavors like that, where it's very demanding. And they do well, but sometimes it's at a cost because they have to work extra hard because they are driven to make things too perfect and to be too detail-oriented. And that takes a long time for them to achieve that. So now here's the downside of perfectionism. Maladaptive perfectionists tend to be more failure-oriented and fear-based in their approach. This leads to more negative outcomes like procrastination, a tendency to avoid challenges, rigid all-or-none thinking, and toxic comparisons, as well as a lack of creativity. So So maladaptive perfectionism is driven by this underlying fear of failure, of feeling unworthy, having low self-esteem, sometimes based on adverse childhood experiences, as well as a childhood possibly full of negative or critical comments due to one's ADHD, if one has ADHD as well. It is frequently accompanied by depression and anxiety, some mild OCD tendencies, eating disorders, and at times even suicidal impulses. It can lead to missed deadlines, pickiness, difficulty making decisions, avoiding commitments, lost opportunities, and a general dissatisfaction with life. Guardedness in relationships and a constant worry and ruminations. So it can be really difficult to manage more extreme maladaptive perfectionism. It can be very weighty and lead to almost a stagnation and paralysis, if you will, from fear of not being good enough and doing anything well enough to do anything. So research has identified two distinctive types of perfectionism. One is called rigid perfectionism, which really involves the sense that your performance has to be flawless and that your worth is based on you being flawless. People who score high on rigid perfectionism tend to feel awful when they fail to meet this extremely high standard they've set for themselves. And they tend to agree with statements like, my value as a person depends on being perfect. So that's a real identity with the need to be perfect to be okay. And then there's the self-critical perfectionist that includes believing that other people make excessive demands on them, and they feel an intense doubt about any mistakes they make and engage in a lot of self-criticism. So people who experience this high level of this kind of perfectionism are more vulnerable to depression. They tend to strongly agree with statements like, when I make a mistake, I feel like a failure. So they define themselves by their level of success and perfection. So perfectionistic patterns, they tend to over-focus on the end result and not on the process of getting there. And that can be very intimidating when you are stuck with a big project or paper or presentation or something you have to prepare for. And they discount any learning that's happened along the way, and they fixate on the end goal. So without meeting the end goal, there is a perception of failure, low self-worth, and sensitivity to feedback or criticism, defensiveness, and a sense of sadness stemming from not having been able to complete the goal because it was too big and overwhelming to begin with, because the standards are often way too high and unrealistic. And then there's a sense of being stuck due to the anxiety of doing it well enough, resulting in a lot of procrastination, stress, and overwhelm. And I call this perfection paralysis or procrastination paralysis, and it can be pretty brutal. It can be very, it can just kind of stop you in your tracks where you just can't even move forward because you can't break it down into smaller, doable steps. It just feels like this big, unattainable goal. So perfectionists often also have ADHD, or ADHD individuals often have perfectionism. So that's a potentially disastrous duo. So let's talk about how they are related. So perfectionism is one way that adults with ADHD try to control outcomes. It's a fundamental aspect of managing their anxiety about being good enough or doing well enough. So living with ADHD, often people experience moments when they're aware they're struggling, or they've messed up, or they're worried they're going to mess up, and they don't exactly know how to fix it or why it's happening. So they develop this persistent worry about when is the next time I'm going to mess up, or when am I going to not do well enough or be criticized. And so perfectionism is a way for them to manage that. It's an inefficient and ineffective coping mechanism, but it does temporarily seem to help manage anxiety related to disappointing others or yourself and insecurity and embarrassment. So some of this material I got from Dr. Sharon Celine. You'll see her name on the slide. She is a clinical psychologist also and has written quite a bit about this, and I've referenced her at the end for some other materials by her. So perfectionism can be a defense against the chaos of impulsivity, weak executive functioning, and that's inherent with ADHD. So you can see how they're related, because perfectionism is a style of being that is developed as a way to cope with the stress and the anxiety of managing all of the inefficiencies and executive dysfunction that often is part of having ADHD. So by trying to control every little thing, it gives us a way to manage the sense of being out of control due to having ADHD. Perfectionism itself shares many similarities with ADHD. Perfectionists are often driven by the fear of disappointing themselves or others. They are kind of all or nothing thinkers. If it's not completely right, then it must be a failure. Setting unrealistic and unreasonable standards and constantly comparing themselves negatively to others are common issues for perfectionists, just as they are for individuals with ADHD, who often compare themselves critically to their neurotypical peers, feeling like they don't measure up and they're not good enough. So both perfectionists and people with ADHD tend to be sensitive to criticism and can be easily discouraged when they can't complete goals. So there are three types of perfectionism in adults with ADHD. This is again work by Dr. Salim. Perfectionism procrastination refers to being immobilized by worry about messing up. This form of procrastination attempts to limit mistakes and reduce future shame. Like, I'm not going to get started on this because I don't know if I can do it perfectly. So instead, I'm going to avoid doing it. I'm sure some of you kind of relate to that one. Another kind is called avoidance procrastination. And this is related to a fear of failure or an expectation of failure based on past experience. I'm going to avoid doing this thing because in the past I haven't succeeded. Why do I think I'm going to succeed now? Or I'm going to avoid doing this because I don't know how to get started and I'm afraid of how it's going to turn out. So that's where the avoidance is paramount. And then there is the production procrastination. And that's a delayed tactic that feels real good. I'm going to do these other things that I know I can do pretty well and then get short-term relief. But I'm not going to do that big thing because I don't know if I'm going to do it well enough. So this is how procrastination and perfectionism are interwoven, with this kind of paralysis of, fear about performance. So this negative cycle continues because when you try to have things just right, it can keep you over-focused on the end result, critical of anything you accomplish, and never satisfied. So it's a cycle of aiming for personal excellence that increases one's anxiety because it is unattainable and it is stressful to try to maintain those high standards that are absolutely both unrealistic and unattainable for most. So you're tied to a negative fixed mindset and expectations based on shoulds instead of focusing on what you can actually do and taking risks and learning from your experiences. So deep inside, you may be walking around feeling ashamed and deficient. And at times you may want something to be right so much that it becomes difficult to get started and on assignments or projects or whatever it is you need to do and to complete them. Hopefully some of you, that makes sense for you and you can understand that pattern in yourself. But we'll give you some ideas of how to fix that too, so don't worry. So here's where anxiety fits in another way. So the need to do something perfectly can create a lot of anxiety, and anxiety can make perfectionism even harder to manage. That's where the dynamic duo kind of comes into play, because one exacerbates the other. So perfectionists do tend to worry a lot in advance about an upcoming project, as they tend to picture how it should turn out, setting a very high standard of excellence. And this further drives the anxiety and the overwhelm, because it's almost impossible to reach that goal. So I'm going to start getting really anxious about it because even thinking about it is just overwhelming. And that's just this vicious cycle. So they feel the need to prove their worth and to compensate for having ADHD by striving for perfectionism and working even harder. They drive themselves to keep working to achieve the standard, which can be very stressful, especially when ADHD-related executive functioning challenges further contribute to the difficulty. They do this to avoid criticism, which is frequent with ADHD, as I'm sure you guys have experienced. There's often a lot of secondary anxiety as well, which coexists with ADHD due to the stress of managing the ADHD, especially in demanding environments. So secondary anxiety has to do with the anxiety that's created by the ADD rather than a coexisting anxiety disorder. It's just the anxiety that comes with the stress of managing your own ADHD. And this can include at times the sense of being an imposter and not measuring up and worrying about dropping the ball. Or when am I going to mess up next? When am I going to forget something important or lose something or miss something because I haven't been keeping track or paying attention? So those are all some of the fears that drive this perfectionism and anxiety cycle. So perfectionist outlook tend to see leads to difficulties completing and submitting projects because they are not impeccable and they're driven by a vague gut level sense that with just a little bit more time, I could do even better. And so assignments or projects become tedious because every detail is seen as one that, if it's not adequately done, will undermine the whole project. I've had clients who have spent hours getting the font just right on, let's say, a PowerPoint slide or a chart or a graph, and it's taken them hours to get it perfect. And that has not contributed really sufficiently to the product. And then they're way behind on getting the content together. And as a result, deadlines are missed, too much time is spent making something perfect, and small details can take up way too much time. So perfectionism magnifies and is magnified by the core features of ADHD and interferes with getting things done. So I like to teach my clients that to compare is to despair. Perfectionists tend to focus on comparing themselves to others and to standards that are much too high. Our modern social media culture does promote and intensify this tendency to compare ourselves to others, especially on all the different platforms that we have access to. And this often leaves us feeling disparaged and less than, and feeling like we can never really measure up. There's always someone in our group or feed or online who's prettier, smarter, more successful, happier, etc. And so it's a very slippery slope when we start looking to others to set our standard or a point of comparison. I try to remind my clients regularly that each of us is designed with a unique set of gifts and attributes which no one else has. No one else can be you. So why waste time and energy comparing yourself to anybody? Be your perfectly imperfect self. And that really is the crux of it. It sounds simple and hard both, because it is. We have to change our mindset, which I'll get to later, about owning our own gifts and our own uniqueness and not comparing ourselves to anybody, because it would be like comparing an apple to an orange. They're both wonderful in their own way, and it's not really a matter of one being better than the other. And that's how you have to learn how to see yourself as well. So just do you, because nobody else can. So let's talk about some strategies to help you overcome maladaptive perfectionism and keep adaptive perfectionism adaptive rather than creeping over that slippery slope edge there of becoming too intense with your perfectionism. So these strategies focus primarily on changing your mindset so that you can better support yourself through the doubt and the negative self-talk, which are at the root of the underlying low self-esteem that fuels perfectionism. So awareness of your critical self-talk is the first step to changing it. So make it a point to be mindful of hearing what you say to yourself and being aware of the language you use. And I will bet that you will notice that what you say to yourself, you would not dare say to a loved one or a friend or somebody you care about, because I'm sure it's quite harsh and punitive and self-critical. So we want to try to notice that first and then catch ourselves and be kind and compassionate and supportive to ourselves, just as we would to a friend who is struggling, and replace the judgment with encouragement and support. You can do this. You've done it before. You don't need to be perfect. Make it just good enough. Mistakes are how we learn. This is some of the self-talk you can learn to engage in with yourself to remind yourself of these truths. It is true that we all make mistakes, and mistakes are a way for us to learn. And it's true that you've most likely been successful at writing a paper or doing a project or whatever it is that you're facing in the past. So you know how to do it. And it's not required that you're perfect. In fact, it's better that you lower your standard to good enough. And that is such an important shift in a mindset, because it is a much more realistic standard, and it gives you more time to focus on the important parts of your project rather than get stuck in the minutia. And the difference between good enough and perfect is small in outcome, but huge in time and energy. So it's a very inefficient standard to maintain. And as I say here, it is the enemy of good and good enough. So you start with what I like to recommend to get the flow going and to overcome sort of that stagnation is to start with the easiest part of whatever the project is first, or the task, and then get the flow going that way, rather than having to rigidly start at the beginning. Sometimes even if it's a product you have to write, dictating can kind of get the flow going better, and then you can go back and edit it. And then you want to catch yourself doing well. Notice the small successes, the steps you have been able to take, what you are good at, what is working for you, and try to build on those. That will give you some motivation and some activation to move forward rather than kind of be fearful and stop in your tracks because of the overwhelm of trying to make it all perfect and noticing the imperfections. And you want to expect to make mistakes and be gentle with yourself when you do. Speaking to yourself the way you would a dear friend or loved one when you do make a mistake. And learning how to accept that that good enough really is good enough, and that if it's not perfect, that's normal and expected, because there really is no such thing as perfect. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about shifting maladaptive mindsets some more. Perfectionists with ADHD tend to believe that the conditions have to be right for them to be successful. They cannot get themselves to start if they feel tired, overwhelmed, distracted, not in the mood, or if circumstances are not exactly right. Like maybe the library is too full when you go to study, or there's too much noise where you need to be working. They also kind of have an insufficiency mindset, which then prompts the desire to escape and to avoid. So we need to help you shift your mindset and break down and frame tasks as doable and the conditions as sufficient. So tell yourself that you do have enough energy to do it, and focus on initiating a doable task for a discrete period of time, such as I'm tired, but I can reread the last paragraph I wrote and work on the report for at least 15 minutes. That would be a discrete, doable task that you can then feel some success in achieving, which will build some momentum and confidence. It also helps to normalize the discomfort with starting a task and reframe it as short-lived and tolerable. So no one is ever in the mood to do work all the time. Remind yourself that working on it will relieve some of that discomfort. So rather than waiting until you're in the mood, start working on something doable and concrete, and that mood will follow. You will feel more like you can continue to engage. Sometimes it also helps to do what I call the 10-minute rule, which is to set a timer for 10 minutes and just make yourself do whatever it is you're putting off for 10 minutes. And at the end of that time, you can choose whether to continue or not. And often people find that once they're over that initial hurdle of starting and they're into it for 10 minutes, the task feels so much less overwhelming and so much more doable. And they've already started to build the momentum toward completing it. So that can be a really useful strategy as well. So creating steps for a specific actionable plan is also an important way to unstick yourself and to move forward, especially steps for task initiation. Like I just mentioned, one particular strategy is the 10-minute rule. But another is to kind of develop a sort of break down a plan of steps you can take. And one rule I like to teach my clients is the eat the frog first rule in tasking, where it can help you get the hardest part over with first. So if you have a task that you keep putting off, let's say starting your taxes, or taking care of some mundane paperwork that you need to submit a claim for, you do that first thing in the day rather than have that monkey on your back all day and then wait till it's really late and you're tired and kind of wrung out from the day anyway. So if you identify each day what your frog is and you do it first, that can lead to a sense of relief and confidence building and momentum as well. So creating structure, support, and accountability in general are ways to help you manage your ADHD and get you to do your tasks. So there are different ways you can do that. If you don't have a friend or a roommate or a family member or a partner that can serve as your body double or accountability partner, you can obtain one virtually through a program called FocusMate, which is an online co-working session platform. And my clients have found this so helpful. In fact, I have a Naval Academy professor who no longer could take ADHD medication for medical reasons, and he saved his whole research career by using FocusMate because he got so much done in those focused sessions. So the way it works is it helps people stay motivated and get tasks done that would otherwise be avoided, because it helps you with timekeeping and time management. You can do it in 25 or 50-minute sessions, and you get on the site at whatever time you want to do your session, and you are anonymously paired with somebody, or randomly rather, paired with somebody who is also wanting to do a session at that time. And then you spend the first couple of minutes introducing yourself and what you're going to do with your time session. And then you have each other in the background virtually while you do your task. And then you report back in the last few minutes about what you've accomplished. And people find this really motivating, and it provides a great sense of support and community. And it's free for up to 3 sessions a week, and then only $5 a month for unlimited sessions. So give this a try. You might find this a really compelling way for you to find that structure, support, and accountability that's so helpful to getting you to mobilize yourself and actually do your tasks. So we're going to talk a little bit about prioritization and time allocation. It's important to set reasonable goals that align with your capabilities and set healthy boundaries and limits for yourself, rather than taking on too much by trying to please others and or striving for unrealistic standards of success. Too many times people will take on things because they sound interesting, exciting, an opportunity, or they don't want to disappoint the person asking them to do it, such as a boss, and they say yes, even though part of them knows it might be too much for them, or too hard, or too time-consuming, and they don't really have the time or the bandwidth to do it. So learn to really be realistic about what your capabilities are and set reasonable boundaries in what you say yes to. That is so critical for not exacerbating this perfectionism, ADHD, and anxiety cycle. So try to take an inventory of what you've said yes to recently, and see if you can eliminate some of those. See if you can delegate some or get rid of some, or even say to whoever you've taken it on for, I misjudged how much time I have. I really can't take this on at this time. And in the future, I ask my clients to ask themselves before they say yes to anything, is this mine to do? And don't say yes until you've had time to assess your schedule and fully answer that question for yourself. Saying to the person that's asked you, that sounds interesting, I need to check my schedule and get back to you. Don't catch yourself saying yes right away, ever, or rarely. And then ask yourself, is this mine to do? Do I have the bandwidth? Do I want to be doing this? Is this in my best interest to spend my time doing this? And really get used to assessing that and being mindful of your own limits and your own work-life balance, so that you're not stuck taking on so much that your personal self-care, like sleep or exercise or other things you do for yourself, or having a social life or spending time with your partner, go out the window because you've taken on too much. So often, as you know, when you have ADHD, there's this one sense of time, and how long a task will take is somewhat distorted or impaired. So often you may take on more than you realize and weigh every task as if it takes the same amount of time and energy, and that every part of it has to be done perfectly. So what I want you to try to do instead is to learn to prioritize tasks and assess their importance, so that you can allocate your time more and effort more effectively. So this helps you to work smarter, not harder. So as I alluded to before, the client who had to make the the graph pretty or the PowerPoint font perfect was not allocating her time very well, because that part of the presentation was not worth those number of hours getting it to look slightly prettier or slightly more perfect. So it's important to sort of step back and think about how much time each part of your project is worth and allocate it accordingly, rather than allocate the same amount of time for everything to make it perfect. And remind yourself that it's better to get something done than run out of time trying to be too perfect and not get it done, and then miss your deadline. So perfectionism is a myth that doesn't really exist, or being perfect is a myth that doesn't really exist. So we need to learn to put a reasonable level of energy, effort, and time into our work, but allow ourselves to have a balanced life as well. So as this little picture sort of suggests, progress and perfectionism. And, you know, it's about making the progress and not getting so perfect that you can't move forward. So good enough standard. That is the new standard you need to learn how to adapt. And I get that it's really challenging for us perfectionists. I am a recovering perfectionist, so I totally get it. But thankfully, I have definitely moved past the intense perfectionism, and just good enough is good enough, and it really is. As you will notice, there are a couple of typos, so it wasn't a perfect presentation either. So here's a few more strategies I want to share with you. Learning not to take things personally is really important, because often perfectionists are afraid to receive critical or negative feedback. So most of the time, others' comments, unless it's directly about your project, are not about you. So when people make comments, often it's about their own sensitivities, their own reactions, their own history, if you will, not about you. And so often people take things personally. We tend to be the first to think people are talking about us, when really they're talking about their own issues that either get projected or that we just assume is about us. And when you do get direct feedback, try to receive it as a gift and an opportunity to learn helpful information so that you can improve outcomes in the future, not as a sign that you're not good enough or that you are a failure in any way. And another thing is important is not to sweat the small stuff. You can get too bogged down in the unimportant details and miss the deadline or be stuck for hours, as I have mentioned before. So as Sandy Maynard shares, when I catch myself obsessing over unimportant details, I stop and I ask myself the following questions. Does it really matter? What is the worst that could happen? If the worst does happen, will I still be okay? Will this matter next week or next year? So here's some questions you can learn to ask yourself to kind of challenge yourself if you're getting stuck for too long. And then it's really important to forgive yourself for any past or current mistakes and move forward, reminding yourself that you did the best you could at the time. Another adage I like to teach my clients is, we all do the best we can in any given moment with the resources we have. I'll say that again because it's that important. We all do the best we can at any given moment with the resources we have. And those resources will change over time. So you need to forgive your past self for maybe being too tired, too stressed, maybe sick, maybe overwhelmed, such that the outcome may not have been perfectly good enough, but you can learn not to dwell on that and not to, condemn yourself, and just know that you did the best you could at the time. And the best you can do is not perfection. It's the good enough standard. And try to envision yourself being in a productive flow state as you approach a project and see yourself doing well. Visualization is a really powerful tool to help you to achieve almost anything you want to do. And it kind of opens up a channel in your brain where you actually see yourself doing the thing that you're putting off. Or if it's, let's say, a speech that you're preparing, you can see yourself actually giving the speech. And you can see yourself doing it articulately and smoothly and confidently. Or if it's taking an exam, you can see yourself answering all the questions and really knowing it and feeling good about it and having plenty of time to do it. Or whatever the endeavor is, imagine yourself, visualize yourself, see yourself actually doing it successfully and calmly and well. And that will really help channel your anxious energy into a productive avenue that can help you, rather than getting stuck in, oh my gosh, I'll never get it right. This is too much. I'm so overwhelmed. So I challenge you to try that strategy instead next time you're anxious about it. So changing your self-talk, as I mentioned before, is really crucial. And awareness is the first step to that. So it's important to use compassionate self-talk and challenge negative self-judgments. The key is to realize that an endeavor can be worthwhile even if it's not perfect. So self-talk such as, mistakes are bound to happen. Remember, nobody is perfect, not even my boss. Making a mistake does not make me less than. It only makes me human. It's okay to have a bad day. Given my busy schedule, I do pretty darn well. These are just examples, and I hope you'll make up your own that speak to yourself with compassion and avoid the self-critical talk, because that is just going to continue you on that downward spiral and keep you stuck in that perfectionism, procrastination loop. So more on self-love and worthiness. Learning unconditional self-love is really the key to not being dependent on having to prove yourself to others in order to receive affection and approval, or to avoid criticism and rejection. This is what's at the root of the perfectionism issue anyway. So it's so important for you to learn how to feel that you are and believe that you are enough and worthy just as you are, even if you would still like to make adjustments and make improvements, as we all do. We're all a work in progress, me included. So recovering from perfectionism requires us to value and honor ourselves as just as good as anybody else, not as an imposter who may get found out, or as deficient and needing to work harder to prove ourselves. Appreciating and valuing your inherent gifts and attributes is essential to loving yourself. Try listing all the positive things others have said about you over the years, or your accomplishments, or anything you can think of that has gone well for you, that you're good at, that you're successful with, that you feel comes naturally to you, because that's really where your gifts lie, is what comes naturally to you. We all tend to disregard the things that are easy for us and assume that they're not that important because they come easily to us. So we often negate our gifts and focus on what's hard for us and define ourselves by those things, by those weaknesses, if you will. And that is, as they say, ass backwards. It's really important that you define yourself by your strengths, by your gifts, by your uniqueness, by your skills, by your assets, and not by your imperfections or things that you need that are weaker for you. Then you can also, once you do that, you can then own some of the quirkiness that comes with ADHD, some of the creativity and the uniqueness that is the ADHD brain of often very wonderfully creative, intelligent, and successful people who provide us often music and art and inventions and all kinds of things that we wouldn't have without this really cool brain. So it's okay to not be perfect and own your uniqueness just the way you are, because you are enough. So meditation is another way that can be helpful in being self-aware of your self-talk and focusing more on self-forgiveness. This is an excerpt I found online from a gentleman who is now a professor, but was a young man struggling very hard in college with his untreated, undiagnosed ADHD. And his journey, he shared some of his journey on a site that I found, and I thought this was kind of useful and inspiring. So I'll read this to you. Meditation has allowed me to let go and not hang on to unwanted thoughts, and instead focus on the more important things in life. It has taught me to be forgiving of myself and to control myself when I get nervous or stressed. This is important, as self-forgiveness plays a big role in procrastination and was a problem for me. Consider procrastination as a transgression against the self. And if you forgive yourself, you are more likely to approach the task in the future. I found that meditation and self-forgiveness paired with exercise has allowed me to be a lot less stressed and have the ability to take a step back and to deal with the task at hand effectively. In particular, most days before going somewhere or completing a task, I need to stop and take deep breaths. So meditation is something I teach all of my clients because it has been proven through research to be super helpful for ADHD. It actually changes your brain at the level of making connections in the attention network that are permanent and cumulative and progressive. So it also helps with health and mental health and emotional regulation. And it helps down to the cellular level in 36 different ways. So meditation is an extremely important thing to incorporate into your daily life if you have not already. And I often recommend starting with guided meditation apps, such as those found on Headspace or Calm, which you can download on your phone and give that a try. 10 minutes a day is sort of a minimum for building this muscle, if you will, in your brain and creating these changes that will help you with your anxiety and your perfectionism and your ADHD. So here are the resources I promised would be at the end, some of which I have referenced in the webinar, and some I have added, such as the last two are books that might be useful. So Too Perfect When Being in Control Gets Out of Control, and Eat That Frog, the 21 Great Ways to Stop Procrastinating and Get More Done in Less Time.
Can you speak about strategies for artists where perfection is admired and appreciated?
There are a lot of artists with ADHD, of course, and art is such an individual expression of your own vision and your own uniqueness that I would encourage you to focus on that rather than on perfection, because there's no such thing. Everyone is different, and the impact of your art on everyone's going to be different. So there is no such thing as perfection, really, with art. There's no standard that you have to meet. It is about expressing your vision and knowing that a certain audience will speak to them and they will get something from it. And the idea of it being perfect is a myth. It is perfect because it is your expression. And that is where your creativity is inspired and intuitive and comes through you. And you need to honor that as being enough and not some artificial standard.
In a work environment, is it best for us to be transparent and let our boss or coworkers know we have ADHD and I guess deal with perfectionism? Or is it best to keep it to ourselves at work?
If you're in the government or other entities that are mostly required to work with you, then it can be really helpful to declare your disability. And I know that CHAD and other organizations have worked hard to get this as an actual disability that you are entitled to have accommodated, to avoid getting sort of either demoted or fired or have a performance improvement plan or something else like that. So they're required to work with you more once you declare it. And certainly if you think that you are failing to meet certain standards or not doing as well as you would like, that might be a good time to mention it before you get too far behind or get too much criticism from your boss, because then it'll give you a chance to kind of get the help you need and to ask for some helpful accommodations that can allow you to perform better. And it will help them work with you rather than sort of make their own conclusions about some of your difficulties. So for those reasons, it can be really helpful. You can also, even without declaring it, you can try to self-advocate and ask for what you need. So if you need a quieter space to be more productive, you need to let your boss know that. If you need to delegate certain types of tasks because they bog you down, you need to tell your boss about that, because you'll be a better employee if you can focus on the things you're good at rather than get mired in the things that take you way too long. It's a win-win for your organization if you can get more of those delegated, to somebody for whom that's not as much of an issue. So there's lots of reasons why it can be productive to, if not declare it, then at least ask for what would be helpful for you. Because if you have a cooperative boss, most of them want you to be the best performer you can be. So this is a win-win for everybody when you do advocate for what you need to help you. And there is something called the Job Accommodations Network, and you can find that online. And there's a whole page of accommodations for ADHD specifically in the workplace that you can take a look at and see if any of those sound like they would be helpful, and then ask for them, even unofficially. But certainly if you feel comfortable and the environment is supportive of that, then do so officially. And you can even ask for a coach. Often some entities will pay for you to have a ADD coach. Sometimes they'll pay for an organizer even. So you would need to declare it to get those kinds of services. So it may be worth doing that.
How do you define what is good enough so that you can just say, okay, in this particular instance, this is good enough and I can move forward and move on?
Good question. So I kind of liken it to perfectionism being an A plus and good enough being a B plus. It could be a high B plus or a low A minus, but you want to kind of aim for that standard rather than this sort of A plus, impossible to reach, perfect standard. So as you may have seen through my slides, I noticed myself in giving the talk and reading them, I had 3 or 4 typos in there. Okay, that was good enough. Most of them are readable anyway. It wasn't perfect, but I didn't sweat it. So that would be an example. So think about B plus, I think would be a good way for you to think about it. It's a solid grade. It's certainly acceptable. And if you strive for B plus, you're likely to get an A minus anyway, but that way you will appropriately allocate your time and energy more so than if you aim for the A plus. People with perfectionism tend to have obsessive compulsive tendencies, and obsessive thinking is part of that, and catastrophizing can be part of that. So it's an irrational thought pattern that is triggered by insecurity and anxiety, and it is a way to try to get control of the worst possible outcome by imagining it happening. And it's a false sense of safety because you erroneously believe that if you think about every possible bad thing that can happen, it will somehow prepare you for when it does. But that's a real myth, and it's a real waste of time and energy, and it tends to make you feel more fearful and less confident and competent than if you avoid that. So try to catch yourself when you go there and try to shift gears and practice imagining that it's going to be successful, or you're going to do well, or you're going to be confident when you get up and give that talk or whatever it is you have to do. So it's a matter of catching it. It's a pattern that's well worn in your brain at this point, and so it does take some effort and some intentionality in recognizing it and not allowing yourself to dwell in it once you do identify that you're doing it, and actively shift gears into a more positive and more realistic approach. Or, yes, I could crash when I go on the next airplane ride, but the chances of that are pretty slim. So I'm going to just trust that it'll be okay because I have no control over that anyway. If it's something you do have control over, do a reasonable amount to protect yourself and keep yourself safe, and then let it go because that's all you can do. Most of it we have no control over. So all we can do is assume and hope for the best and imagine the best happening. That's much more productive. So catch yourself, don't give into it, and shift gears.
How do you bring yourself to eat the frog when you don't have the motivation to do so?
Well, that's a good question too. So there are different ways you can motivate yourself. Some people are good at withholding something they really want to do as a reward and then not allowing them to do it until they finish that frog. So it could be your favorite game on your phone. It could be checking your social media. It could be, I don't know, talking to your friend. It could be watching your favorite YouTube video stream. So try to find something that motivates you that you don't allow yourself to do until you've done the frog. That's one strategy. Try to think of whatever you can that's going to activate you. So having structure and support is really important. So do a focus mate session because that will give you that accountability and structure and might help you get over that initial hump. And that might be able to get you to eat the frog. So plan your frog around doing a focus mate session, for example. Some people find that putting on music is motivating. For others, it's distracting. So it depends on if that activates you. That could be one possibility. Those are some strategies. Try the 10-minute rule. See if you can eat your frog for 10 minutes. And then most of the time you might find that once you've gotten into the frog, it doesn't seem quite as yucky as it seemed at the beginning before you even started it.
I do have a follow-up question from Alice. she was wondering, and I think we talked about this earlier in the presentation, that there are other things that you can do other than eating the frog. So maybe focusing on the easier tasks rather than the harder tasks. So that's an alternative option as well.
Absolutely. That's definitely an alternative option. Do something easy first. But we want to avoid putting off the frog till the end of the day, or putting it off completely by doing only the things we like to do or the things that are easy. So it's a kind of a balance of the two. That's why the eat the frog first kind of gets you to get the hard stuff out of the way, so you're not going to be as likely to procrastinate, because what's left is not as hard. So, yeah.
Thank you. The next question is, do you have a fast and easy way to detect if the need for a strategy is due to perfectionism or due to ADHD?
And yeah, the answer is really the same things that I've been talking about. That would be the answer for both of them. The perfectionism part of it is about the fear of not doing well enough. And the ADD piece of that gets exacerbated is that sometimes the poor time management, poor planning, poor ability to attend for extended periods of time to get it done, the tendency to avoid, things that are effortful. So the combination certainly, plays into each other, but I'm not sure it really matters that you dissect that apart if you have flavors of both.
Is there a particular type of meditation? When you recommended meditation, is there a specific meditation that helps with perfectionism?
There is no specific meditation. I usually recommend mindfulness meditation. That's the one that's been most studied, or TM works too. So mindfulness or TM have been shown in the research to really help with ADHD in general. And perfectionism, I'm not sure if there's any research directly with how meditation helps perfectionism, but as you saw from that gentleman that shared his own journey, he found it super helpful. And most people with ADHD do. Perfectionists are not, but it can help you kind of distance from getting sort of hyper-focused on the minutia and on making everything perfect, and remind you of the fact that you are more than that one perfect part of that project. So in general, I would suggest mindfulness is easiest to learn and is most accessible. And there are lots of free apps available to teach you that. For those that know TM already, that's a good one to practice, but it's a little more complicated to start if you've never done it before, and you have to ostensibly find a guru and get given a mantra, etc. So it's just a little harder to access.
Do you have any suggestions for those of us, either spouses, parents, partners, that are living with an adult with ADHD that is dealing with perfectionism? Is there something that we can do to help those that we love?
Well, certainly we can help each other provide accountability and support and structure to avoid the procrastination part of it. As Kathleen Nadeau, another ADD expert I've worked well with for a long time, suggests a body double is really important. Having another person physically in your space, even if they're not actually doing the work with you, just having them there keeps you on track better and keeps you from avoiding procrastination. But the perfectionism piece of it, if the other person reminds you of your past successes, reminds you that mistakes are normal, reminds you of the good enough standard, and some of the strategies I've talked about, that can be helpful, because often perfectionists will get stuck in their own, in their own head with these negative comments, and they forget. And so having someone else remind you of those things can also be helpful to encourage and support you, much as I'm trying to get you to learn to do for yourself.